In Saskatoon Provincial Court this week, I was the sole reporter in the courtroom when the man responsible for that explosion at that very courthouse last year was sentenced after pleading guilty to charges that include obstructing justice, public mischief, and the big one, arson. He was sentenced to 2 years less a day. It was a joint submission from both the Crown and Defence, saying that the sentence takes into account the severity of the act, but also the fact that Rodney James Wilkie did plead guilty and spared the need for a trial. The facts of the case are that on March 29th, 2017, at about 10 o'clock, Wilkie called in a fake police report. He was reporting some gang violence that wasn't taking place in an attempt to misdirect police because his plan was to place a homemade explosive in front of one of the entrances to the Saskatoon Provincial Courthouse about an hour later. And that's exactly what he did. Video surveillance from inside the courtroom showed him outside the entrance, spraying something on the ground and then throwing a lighted object at what was determined to be a backpack with a small camping propane tank in it. About 2 minutes later, the propane tank exploded, and that's what caused the damage that the public saw going by the courthouse the next day. The ceiling overhang was severely damaged and a glass door was broken, and the damage estimated just over $6,000. And what we heard was that the reason for this, the motive, wasn't an act of terrorism, as people were maybe thinking was the possible motive. He actually had an impaired driving case that was set for the next day. He was going to plead guilty to those charges, and he thought that it meant he would have to be going to jail the next day. And he didn't want to, he wasn't ready for it, and he said that there were some other things that needed to take place first. So instead of consulting with the lawyers and finding out that in fact the Crown had consented to this adjournment all along, he decided to make this explosive and put it in front of the courthouse. He also made a phone call the next day to police threatening to, quote, finish the courthouse off. Right after he made that phone call, he actually walked into the courtroom that he was expected to be in that day, pled guilty to his charges, and his sentencing was adjourned. So the courtroom hearing just how unnecessary this whole thing was, and the judge used the words unsophisticated and impulsive. The accused, Mr. Wilkie, he spoke to the court, and he did apologize for what he did and said that he never intended on harming anybody, and nobody was hurt in this incident. And the defense stressing that this wasn't an act of terrorism or a hate crime or even done to thwart justice, because he was admitting that he was guilty to those impaired driving charges. It was just an attempt at a delay that had gone terribly wrong. You can read more about this story on our website at thestarphoenix.com.